Institute of Language Studies and Research, Kolkata, is a research establishment focusing on cultural studies, translation, post-colonialism, gender studies, and such various other domains in the Southeast Asian perspective. As a part of our research endeavors here, we regularly hold invited lectures at Institute of Language Studies and Research. Today, we gather for one such special lecture by Eleanor Marcussen. Today's lecture, Tracks Through Nature, Infrastructure and Sociological Change by Eleanor Marcussen. Let me introduce you to our speaker today. Eleanor Marcussen is a researcher in history in the Department of Cultural Sciences and member of Linnaeus University Center for Concurrences in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies, LNUCC. She is the program coordinator of the Master's Program in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies. She joined LNU as a postdoctoral fellow in 2018. Through 2019 and 20, she was an MWK Co-Fund Fellow at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies, Max Weber Kolleg Erfurt at the University of Erfurt. Before joining LNU, Marcussen taught world history as an assistant professor in history in the North-South University, Dhaka, Bangladesh, 2017 to 2018. Marcussen holds a PhD in South Asian history from Heidelberg University, Germany, where her doctoral research was conducted in the research group Cultures of Disaster, Shifting Asymmetries Between Societies, Cultures and Nature from a Comparative, Historical and Transcultural Perspective in the Cluster of Excellence, Asia and Europe in a Global Context, funded by the German Research Council. She has received several scholarships and fellowships as a doctoral student, among them being a junior research fellow at the School of Ecology and Environment Sciences Studies at the Nalanda University in Bihar and New Delhi 2013 to 14. Her book, Acts of Aid, Politics of Relief and Reconstruction in the 1934 Bihar-Nepal Earthquake examines the organization of relief and reconstruction work by civil society and the state of India in the 1930s. The socio-political history on the aftermath of the 1934 Bihar-Nepal earthquake explores disaster aid, relief and reconstruction and the questions they give rise to about class, communities and inequality. The book traces disaster responses across the 20th century in order to demonstrate how they were embedded in political processes transcending the event of the earthquake. Aid, relief and reconstruction mirrored political agendas and ideas that articulated both changes and continuities by the colonial state, civil society and international organizations. The impact of the earthquake and aid in its wake varied widely according to social groups, ethnicity and gender in the aftermath. By studying the effects of the earthquake on communities directly affected the society, Eleanor Marcussen argues that we can come closer to an understanding of the role political, social and cultural factors held in shaping resilience to natural disasters. This title is also available as open access on Cambridge Core. In the field of historical disaster research, her interests include the perceptions of risk, the introduction of new building technologies, humanitarianism and the politicization of disasters. Please welcome Eleanor Marcussen. I'll also ask our director, Dr. Shatibu, to now felicitate the speaker. Thank you, Madam Director.
Sorry. Thank you very much for this warm introduction. And many thanks to the director, Professor Swati Guha, for inviting me and also accommodating me in your very busy schedule. Am I audible or should I?
Yes,
yeah, okay, good. And also many thanks to all of you for coming here to listen to me today. This is indeed a very busy time of the year, as we know, researchers, and I also know in Kolkata the book fairs and other events are on the schedule. So I'm very thankful to the Institute and the staff for here for facilitating my talk today. So let me start by saying, just as you heard in the introduction, that I'm an historian specialized in South Asian history. And I did my PhD at the South Asia Institute at Heidelberg University. I have a long-standing research interest in environmental history. As you heard, primarily through my research on disasters, and specifically so the construction of the disasters and the longer aftermath, both what should I say, the reconstruction and relief processes, how we encounter it in the political history, but also theoretical ideas around the construction of what is risk and disasters in different cultures and different settings. So I worked in a research group for quite a few years on both images of disasters as well as the cultural history of disasters. And now I'm slightly shifting grounds towards more long-term socio-ecological processes, but it's still the interest in environmental history that drives my ideas that goes into this project. And I'm also looking forward to comments from all of you, because there's truly an interdisciplinary project where I try to include also more STS perspectives and ideas about infrastructure as integrated into social history perspective. But I also know from colleagues in the literature and languages departments that there's a lot to gather from literary sources when it comes to infrastructure studies. And the infrastructural turn in the social sciences has also had a huge impact on the humanities, as some of you may know. I also know, for example, from Dr. Schwarteguha's recent conference visit here, it also comes into the studies on in gender studies, for instance, infrastructure. We have people as infrastructure is another theme, not just built infrastructure, but infrastructures of natures, infrastructures of human beings. So there's surely a lot of intersecting ideas there. So I should also mention, as I heard in the introduction, that I'm in post-colonial studies, where I also gather a lot of inspiration from comparative colonial histories, and that goes into, for example, in northern Sweden, there is a lot of research on how infrastructures have helped to build the nation state by acquiring land and access to tribal areas, what is now called Lapland as a part of Sweden, but originally then called the Sapmi territories. And we have also now reverted to calling it Sapmi, territories of Sami people. So there also we see these infrastructural expansions as a way of acquiring land and governance infrastructures over not just land but over people too. So there is a lot to gather, and this, I should say, is also not just Sweden. That's a national territory, but it stretches across parts of Norway, Finland, as well as into Russia. So that is one side of being in colonial and post-colonial studies that I think has not so far inspired my previous work, but increasingly is doing so at the center. So let me start my PowerPoint. Should I just close down this one? So this is just let me introduce, this is my new project that I'm presenting here, and by new I mean it's not the same as my previous book project. And I haven't published anything directly from this project yet, so I'm very much in favor of comments. I have a chapter which I'll come back to here, which I wrote as a postdoc, and my current project is building up on those ideas that I gathered. So, Tracks Through Nature, Infrastructure and Socio-Ecological Change is the bigger title of my project. So I'm just here today presenting some inferences and ideas that I have discussed in a couple of conferences. This is more like a working paper than a proper lecture of my accumulated research over a long time. And the project is running until 2025, so I'm a bit more than midway into it. But as you know, it was also a time of the pandemic, so some of my research in the archives was severely delayed. I basically kicked it up in 21 when we had quite a rough situation both in Sweden as well as in the UK and India in terms of accessing sources. And I just came back from a visit to the Mumbai archives, the Maharashtra State Archives at the Elphinstone College in Mumbai. So I gathered some new sources that I haven't included here, but it's also on the expansion of infrastructure in terms of extracting coal that would then feed the railway, right, in order also to change the circulation of natural resources that naturally came or was driven by the expansion of the railways. Especially in those areas that I will present on here today, which is Western Khandesh and Berar, which I think to this audience are quite well-known areas in present-day Maharashtra and central, what was then central provinces. This image we have here is a slide from the Peninsula Railway that when it was being built, one of those photo albums that document the stretch from Boregat into the inlands of Umravati and Bosavalu's railway points, but also the cotton districts that was expanded in Western Khandesh and Berar. Next slide, please. So let me start by an extract from a letter, which is sort of meant to set the scene a bit about the sources that we find in the government correspondence when it comes to laying out the railways. Some of these surveys you might think are early in terms of the railways, but it goes back to the 1840s and 1850s when it comes to the planning of the railway in this region. So this is in 1861 when the railway has already started being built in this region. Sorry, is it surround? Am I too close? So this is a curious thing, that the water in Berar Valley should be generally so bad as this. When warm, the water is clear, but the taste of it is greatly resembles tea water. The whole valley was originally covered with a low bubble bushwood, and in almost all cases, the water found in Berar, where this bubble tree jungle prevails, is salty and brackish. This bubble bushwood, with the exception of patches here and there, having been chased away, the ground sown with cotton, linseed, which are the two paying crops, wheat and sovari are also sown. Grass is not obtainable, it does not grow in this bubble tracts. This too be had was near the dikes. This point is of course added to the bad quality of the water, the valley being unsuitable for troops, but especially for cavalry. Kurki is the grass had, which is very expensive. This is owing to the great manufacture of cotton in Berar. In the whole valley under cultivation, and the bubble jungle chased away, wood, which is another great demand, is very rare and scarce. The line of railway passes by Mulkapur and Akola on to Omravati. I cannot say much for the progress they have made. Mr. Lee, the contractor, told me he experienced the central difficulty is obtaining coolies. The coolie hire in this part of the country is 2 annas a day for a man. Mr. Lee doles out paid by the day, but by the amount of work done, and I understand his salary, that a man could easily earn 8 annas a day. So this extract in several ways narrate the environmental issues and the transformation from the colonial officer's perspective when the railway expansion began. It highlights the ecological difficulties experienced in terms of extending the railways in this particular area. The scarcity of water, the scarcity of grass is one issue that the colonial officers experienced in terms of crossing the land and accessing the land. And of course, the expansion of cash crops, cotton and linseed, are well familiar in the historical literature, and this area is known for the expansion of the railways in the 1860s. due to the cultivation of cotton, right? But it also then reflects the labor situation, which some of my colleagues, I'll come back to that later, have written extensively about, based on an archive, contextualized of course, but based on an archive at Linnaeus University, the Joseph Stevens Archives, that some of you may have heard of before. But in general, these dimensions, the expectations here, are things that recur in the literature of in the colonial archive very much in terms of difficulties. And again, the the availability of food for different purposes, for construction and so forth, is also extremely familiar when we talk about the railways in India. The whole protection of forest, for example, came up as a result, as we have seen in the literature on railways. So these are the thematics that go into it. But then, please, next one. So what does infrastructures do, and especially then large infrastructures, we may ask. I'm, however, interested not just in the larger infrastructure, but also in the smaller changes that we see in the local societies here. What do they do in terms of ecological relations, how people relate to nature and the environment around us? In this paper here then today, in my presentation, I discuss some of these cases that I find on how infrastructure impact local communities in terms of transforming land access and mobility specifically. And as I will come back to, of course, infrastructures facilitate mobility, but it also changes access to the landscape. We are quite familiar with this in our present-day society also, in terms of embankments, for example. It's a recurrent issue. Or in terms of intersecting infrastructures, railways, canals, and also, of course, roads, right? How it comes together and facilitates access to new areas. But here I'm focusing specifically on water and land in terms of mobility. And in today's energy and transport transition towards sustainable mobility of goods and people, railways are of course considered to be one of the best options, if not the best options. But at the same time, if we look at historical studies, they underline the adverse effects of the construction of railways. How it has impacted land use, how it has changed ecologies and livelihoods also in terms of labor relations. We see that in India, where we have a struggle between the public work departments and also the railway construction, as well as the daily wage labor for agricultural labor. So this is also something we see in the historical literature that we also see, which I also see in my research, but I don't dwell much on the whole labor discussion, simply because it is, what should I say, a big side discussion, and it's a huge topic in itself that is economic history more than what I'm interested in. So we can also see that this extraction, of course, was the expansion of the railways was based on the extraction of export of raw materials, but also the planning of military and financial interests, of course. If we come back to what I mentioned before, the comparative studies in colonialism, but also infrastructures and nationalism, there have been similar studies on, for example, nationalist territorial expansions in the Nordic countries, interestingly enough, but not more importantly maybe in this case, British imperial expansion of railways in the colonies reflected visions of imperial ambitions for trade, profits, and different connections then. Planning of national infrastructure projects involved these larger political choices and discourses that we see also here in my research. Planning of national infrastructure projects, in the British imperial context, the colonial government's use of railways for governance and resource extraction is now fairly uncontested. This is also well established in the literature. But of course, we saw before that there was a colonial narrative of the railways as a boon and as a source of progress and economic growth. Especially we saw it after the famine. So this was also a shift in literature where we first had this idea, the colonial narrative of infrastructure, and then after that another history writing which was more critical, especially on the use of timber, for example, and the forest extraction that came with the railways. I'm, however, as I mentioned before here, inspired by some of the environmental and technological understandings of infrastructure. There is this scholar called Thomas Seller who argues that infrastructure remains deeply embedded in non-human environment and often create new environmental context. And simply put, he means that infrastructures together with human beings changes the environment that we have in certain ways. And with the environment, he doesn't necessarily mean nature, right? It's the social environment that we move in, and the circuits, how we move and what we do, changes with it. So when large-scale infrastructure enters into relationship with the environment, what are these new different meshes of human and non-human nature? And at the same time, infrastructure studies then in the larger context can tell us more about people and nature, how they work and how they form infrastructures. I mentioned before, for example, Simon's paper, People as Infrastructure, which has been quite influential also. So I wish to explore these effects of infrastructure based on some of these ideas. I would say, let me move on to, so I mentioned some of these, somehow I feel like it's perhaps a bit of a redundant literature to many of you who are familiar with the historical context of India very well, or South Asia. But of course, the dominant position in social history sees infrastructural development in social, cultural, and ideological terms as this form of tools to consolidate imperial power. That is how infrastructure has been often narrated in the historical literature, that the colonial government, with collaborators to a great extent, used infrastructure as a tool for accessing power, resources, and of course also then gain financial capital in the empires. Right? So Hedrick's thesis, Tools of Empires from 1981, spearheaded this historical narrative very much. And then again, Hedrick's Power Over Peoples from 2010 also continued this as the title revealed, of course, Power Over Peoples. But also it continued it, but it also shifted focus to the environmental factors that also appropriated but also limited the different ways that infrastructure could work. And we also have David Arnold's work on environment, society, and technology. Hedrick's later work also took up this colonial perception of how progress, nature, and scientific advances shaped and to a great extent developed when it encountered non-European environments. And there's also this idea then that the colony was a great, served as a great experiment to develop some of these technologies later on in the Middle East and in Europe. So again, a tool that went beyond just being a tool, of course, in the setting of South Asia. Hedrick's and others' work criticize their earlier claims that railways are successful transfers of what is perceived as Western knowledge, technology, and innovation, all neutral to social circumstances. So now, when the railways are to some extent researched as a part of the larger colonial project, political and social histories in particular have tried to show how technology operated in situated specific context. And that's also where my work, I hope, will make an impact. Whether roads, electricity, dams, or telegraph lines, research have focused on control, power, and research extraction, but less so on environmental consequences brought on by the infrastructures in their own right. In particular, the innovations in and expansions of infrastructure in Britain and the colonies were of primary importance for its networks of power. Environmental consequences of imperialism remain analyzed as the outcome of the raw materials exploited, while the railways, which enable the expansion of trade and communications, rarely feature as a part of the analysis. Instead, environmental historians have found deforestations to be the major environmental consequence of the railways in terms of demand for wood, for sleepers, as well as for fuel. I would also like to mention the work by Ritika Prasad, for example, Tracks of Change, where she also discusses the floodwater impact of embankments. So it's also the nexus of different disasters, like natural disasters as they were interpreted, but of course socially construction through the construction of railways and roads. Her focus is, however, slightly later. In the 1919, for example, she gives example of these breaking of railways in Bihar, the embankments for the railways, because they caused great flooding. I see the same in the 1934-35, for example, when the land changed. There were also breaking of embankments because of the flooding that was caused and in the aftermath. So this is something that comes up and is not so, of course, prominent in the 1960s, because these are the very first years of the railway in that area, which I'm talking about and researching. But similar to other parts of the world, railway companies in India, they utilize embankments as cost-effective mechanism for dealing with substantial changes in gradients, as well as for laying tracks across low-lying deltaic areas with uneven terrain. Problems, of course, arose with these drainage outlets. For example, McAlpin, also in her research, has highlighted the increase in malaria in connection with railways and road construction because of the stagnation of water that comes with it. So I would say that social histories of railways in South Asia have definitely highlighted these local effects of infrastructure and how it impacts livelihoods and life in villages and communities. More recently, we also have Devjani Bhattacharya's Empire and Ecology in the Bengal Delta, the Making of Kolkata, which I assume many of you are familiar with as we speak here in Kolkata. But also, for example, Rohan D'Souza's work, Dammed and Drowned, and not the least Iftikhar Iqbal's Environmental History of the Bengal Delta, which then also stretches into what is today Bangladesh. While Rohan D'Souza then, of course, focuses on Orissa mainly. But again, this is the same idea that we have this construction of certain infrastructures, whether it is railways or dams and canals and so forth, but it still has intersects with how local life progresses or is led. And a very interesting book, fairly recently, or 2015, was published by Pallavi Das, Colonialism, Development and the Environment, Railways and Deforestation in British India, from 1860 to 1884. And I think that book is hugely helpful also, although of course she focuses on the deforestation, which is a major topic when we talk about the environmental issues and the railways. We have another one by Rita Bambi, The Great Indian Peninsula Railway, which my research also relies upon to a great extent, because it is really the railway stretch that I am focusing on also, although she's not taking an environmental focus. And then we also have Ganeshwar Nayak has edited a volume called The Railways in Colonial South Asia, Economy, Ecology and Culture, which also then in an interdisciplinary manner touches upon railways and ecologies, which I find also very interesting in bringing out certain perspectives that I might not have found from purely historical literature. Towards the end, I would also like to mention Aparajita Mukhopadhyay's Imperial Technology and Native, within brackets, Agency, A Social History of Railways in Colonial India, 1850s to 1920. where she also then brings in these local perspectives on the railways. So again, a great social history of how railways impacted local societies and can be written into social history. There are also more, as I mentioned before, comparative colonial work, and let me just mention two here. Manu Karuka from 2019 has written Empire's Tracks, Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers and the Transcontinental Railroads, which again is this, comparative focus on infrastructure and imperialism. The last one I would like to mention here is from North Scandinavia, by Laura Junka IQ, whose settler colonial state, Arctic Railway, State Transformation and Settler Self-Indigenization in Northern Finland. And this is again this idea of the expansion of the railways into territories of Sapmi, and the question of who is the local and who is the settler, and the different people that get access to certain areas because of infrastructures. And I briefly touched upon some of the STS studies, but I will not go into that here. But I mentioned rather, I would say the main influence in terms of South Asian history that has influenced me in writing environmental and social history. Next slide, please. So, to sum up this brief part of the introduction, Boregat is perhaps one of the most famous parts of this stretch, the great GIPR as it is called in abbreviation. And it is one of those experiments where there were some large-scale built constructions that was awed in photographs and unparalleled in British constructions in terms of scale and scope. You might not see it so clearly here, but the number of people that went into the construction is quite mind-boggling only from the photos, and there are of course a lot more people behind the scenes, right? But this part is of course not what is, I think, the most interesting, but rather the smaller everyday railway constructions, the smaller railway sites, for example, relatively small I should say, because they're quite influential, like Bosaval, for example, as a railway hub, or Akkola and Umravati because of the cotton markets. But in terms of railway literature, so to say, they are minor compared to the Boregat. So what I'm interested in, then I look at the water access, capital, labor and construction material, spaces for local perspectives on resources, and also this entangled relationships that is created when it comes to the main traveler on the railway in this period, in the 1860s to 65, which is the cotton and the linseed, right? It is not the persons that are in focus when it comes to the expansion of the railways. It's not transport for people we're looking at here. It is transport of materials and making a more efficient road for the cotton to reach the harbors in Bombay. Next slide, please. So I'll just flip back to what I mentioned at the beginning, the Joseph Stevens Archives, where I spent 1 year as a postdoc working on a project on the circulation of knowledge and resources. And very interestingly, and perhaps surprising to many, Joseph Stevens was a contractor at this very stretch in India. He came from Copenhagen. He was an Anglo-Scandinavian person, British parents, but born and raised in Stockholm and Copenhagen, so his English wasn't far from perfect, I know for sure after having read all his correspondence. And he made a fortune as a contractor, as a very efficient subcontractor, and then a contractor in his own right. And he returned to Sweden he didn't return to Sweden because his family was then based in Copenhagen, but he knew of investments through his godfather in southern Småland, where also Linnaeus University is based, where I am presently a researcher. So interestingly, he went with his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law was an engineer, proper engineer, working first on the railways in between Roskilde and Copenhagen in Denmark, where he then met Joseph's sister, and this was a very convenient match, because Joseph then could follow his brother-in-law to India as a contractor when the brother-in-law was transferred. So in 1859 he set sail for India, and 1860 to 68, if I'm not wrong, he spent, 69 he returned the last time from India. He went and bought his estate in between, invested his money, the fortune he had made in this estate, which 66, 67, so the prices went down and he was able to afford to buy this great estate with the money made in India. And it's also interesting that afterwards then, which I have written quite a bit about, he was one of the forerunners in building the railways in southern Sweden in order to export natural resources from southern Sweden to imperial harbors, to the British Empire. So he learned a lot in India, not just in terms of engineering training, because he trained to become a civil engineer, but more so interestingly, he learned about the trade routes and the value of natural resources at certain points, of course, in this period. So I have spent quite some time then first on this postdoc working on some of the sources in this archive, which has also been explored by many other researchers in terms of looking at labor contracts, because Joseph then had collected and brought with himself a huge chest with papers of the contracts that he made with the labor gangs in Akkola and so forth, in Kaldensjön-Berar, in the 1860s. And this was found only in 2008 and catalogued. So it was stored on this attic from 1867 until 67, 69, until 2008, and then it was found when they were cleaning out the attic, like a full chest of papers that were then catalogued at the archives at Linnaeus University. So it's been quite a journey for these papers, and if we go to British Library, or if I go to collections, for example here, these kind of petty contractor, subcontractor papers are extremely rare to come by, because you don't find these subcontractors in the colonial archives. There you have the contractors, the big contractor names that often had offices in London or globally in the US also for that matter. But these subcontractors were on a much pettier standard and did the interaction. He spent his day riding across the plains and trying to find laborers and settle contracts. So it's certainly a fortune maker who came out only 19 years old and then returned in his late 20s to Sweden again. Sorry, next one. So this is some of the publications I just wanted to mention in connection with that project, and also Margareta Pettersson, a literature scholar who is now retired, Professor Emerita, was written on especially the women in the Stevens family, because Joseph's sister then also lived quite some time in India, and her husband then also the relations that they had and made in India and then returned to. The imperial underbelly, workers, contractors and entrepreneurs in colonial India and Scandinavia, edited by Gunnar Sedlöf, where I also have a chapter, and that was my part of my postdoc project. So in all these publications you find some chapters on Joseph Stevens and related, I would say, mainly labor history publications. And there you see then the example of the famous box that was sent back. There was an exhibition that we made at Linnaeus, at Huseby Estate actually in 2019. So yes, next please. So, as previous research has dwelled on at length, the construction of the railway was instrumentally and intrinsically linked to the export of raw materials, and specifically cotton, in the context of India in the 1860s. This cash crop agriculture expanded with the inception of colonial rule in western parts of India in the 1820s, for which the railways was meant to provide quick and affordable transport to the ports. In western India, where the railways was pushed ahead for commercial interest, deforestation had consequently begun 40 years before railways would facilitate even larger areas to be brought under cultivation. The implementation of the GIPR facilitated global trade by connecting the two most important metropoles in British India, Bombay and Kolkata, at the same time as it changed circulation and access to local resources and environments. Amalendra Guha has published Raw Cotton of Western India, 1715 to 1850s, which details this rerouting of transport links as the harbour in Bombay gained significance. Cotton cultivation and railway connections in Berar and Khandesh had been preceded by considerable experimentation with cotton seeds in Dharwar, more to the west in Bombay Presidency. Since 1835, experiments with American cotton seeds have been introduced and deemed a curious failure to the colonial administration, explained by the lack of rain and alternative water resources. We can see here, maybe this is a little bit blurry, this image, but you see here the great cotton fields of India supplying very little to England from want of roads and the coast. Roads to the coast, excuse me. So this is in the Chapman Papers, a famous railway constructor from 1846 in the British Library. So in 1846, this was already on the map that they needed better railways to export the raw materials of India. And you, of course, you see the other, this is just one slice of it, but cotton is already then very important for the British Empire. No cotton you see just to the south, and then we have, of course, opium down there. Then we have further south again, good cotton, uncertain climate, very inferior cotton, etc. Right? So cotton is definitely on the map, literally, figuratively speaking. And there also you have inferior to English use and so forth, jungle, uncivilized tribes with the quotation marks, and so forth, right? So they are very particular in terms of the resources that can be extracted at this point of time. And the experiments then with Egyptian cotton began already in the 1830s, so this was on the map very early on. But in the 1860s then, we have also many things coming together. It was the Santal Rebellion, which is also very familiar to the audience here today, of 1855, and also the uprising, of course, of the so-called uprising, the First War of Independence, 1857, which both suspended the construction, but also changed some of the construction, the idea of different towns and so forth. The East India Company was abolished and the British Crown took over. So there was some replanning that was done in the middle of this. Not the least also the Suez Canal came up and opened in 1869, which would further facilitate this construction, right? So this infrastructure was a part of a larger network of infrastructure. Next, please. We also see these curious extensions of the map which tell us something about the importance of cotton. So here is for the plans of railways and roads in the 1830s and the 1850s, and this is published in 1815, then only about 5 years after the previous slide I showed you, where they have expanded by a little paper, fold-out paper, where the railways are supposed to go into Berar, right? So it was not even on the print to begin with. So quite interestingly, this is sort of say progressing the idea of the railways as it is being made. Next, please. And as we can see here then, sort of zooming in more and more on the map of the region which I'm working on, we have the contract maps. This is contract number 13, which Joseph Stevens worked on extensively, where we have these Umravati that I mentioned before, but also Shigam, where he built a ginning press for the cotton for transport, facilitating transport. And all of these smaller places along the railway line that he worked on, expanding then into Berar. We can take the next one. Just I wanted to show this being zooming in of the the bigger colonial project, and then we have these small local maps where we find even more sources. Yeah, next please. And here we see then the Tapti River, just to situate where the railway would then be laid later on. So this is the military map from 1818, and the map you saw just before of the railway construction is then I drew it roughly, I shouldn't say exactly, but pulled the red line here to see approximately how it goes with the rivers and the small tributaries in this area, because this is very important to understand also how the railway was planned according to water access, but also not disruption from the water. And you see, of course, Nagpur there is maybe a good landmark in terms of directions, because it's still, Umravati and Akola are maybe not the most familiar places to everyone even today, I guess. And you see Tapti River is, of course, and Varda River is, of course, also quite big ones that will also be important for the water access to the railway, which, because of course water was needed, but also not to obstruct or be obstructed by the water. Next please. So I will give two examples here from what I've been looking at in terms of materials. I would just also say that I have a table of contents that I'm not sharing here because it's still very rough of the idea of my my book project that will come out of this at the very end, hopefully the first few articles. But one of them is specifically then how labor and stone laying, not labor politics as such, but different stone techniques in terms of building railway bridges and viaducts and embankments come into it, because it's done by local labor and local materials that are also then sourced locally. And the other one would be on accessing water. Another chapter is on accessing water, specifically then looking at ecology and power, cattle, and the nodes and networks that are created around water resources. And another chapter would then be more on the global grids and how infrastructure is connected locally to the global larger connections, which I talked about slightly in the beginning, briefly here also. Here we have the example then of cattle accidents. One fatal accident occurred that is documented quite extensively in the archives, in Maharashtra State Archives in the railway section. So the cattle then would walk up on the rails, and it resulted in the adoption of a new railway cattle guard to put in front of the engine, right, to block the animals from coming under. And it also resulted in the review of fencing on this stretch, which was because it was a recurrent problem with cattle attempting to cross the tracks for accessing water, right? So it's not just humans here, but it's also how cattle interact with the railways. It was not just construction, of course, that would change the access for the capital, but it would also be the management of villages here. The colonial government would say it's also the duty of the villagers to herd the cattle instead of allowing them to roam freely. So the practice of cattle herding would also be impacted by the railways, right? The way that cattle are managed. Another way would also be, pointed out in connection with this accident and the following documents, would be to restrict the level of the number of cattle of the villages in certain areas where you have infrastructures. But along the railways, one of the primary methods, and perhaps not so surprising, would be fencing to keep the cattle off the tracks, different forms of fencing. Also humans, for that matter. I have not read much about the human accidents. Cattle would be much more prevalent, but there are instances of children, for example, roaming up on the tracks, very unfortunate accidents, but that would be on passages which have to remain open. So this is more on agricultural lands where the fencing would be put up. So from 1850s onwards, revenue survey operations served to encourage the spread of cultivation and regulate land tax. The same service also recorded plows and plow cattle by different communities, and especially tribal communities who worked in agriculture in this region. So cattle rearing in Khandesh and Berar was gradually circumscribed by laws in the same period. So it's also not just the railways, of course, but it's details also in general how communities are governed here. The surveys from the 1860s I have not looked on because I haven't found them, but from 1880s and 1890s there are quite extensive surveys from Jalgaon, Bosaval and Pachora, these local places, towns, where we see the management of jungles and scrub jungles and cattle moving in these areas, so-called pastures for these lands. What would be used then as a type of as a material for fencing would be the rubber plants, but it was quite soon discontinued, and then we have the prickly pear was used as a fencing plant, and then of course we also have different wood, but the problem with wood would be that the white ants would come and eat it up, so it would be eroded quite fast. That's why live plants was mainly tried out for fencing operations in this area. In the end, even iron standards was put up in order to keep out cattle from crossing. I would also, as I mentioned here, Rohan Debroy at Reading University has discussed this so-called entomopolitics, and political entomology from 2003 by Brown also. Rebecca Brown, I think, if I'm not wrong, where we see this shift again from a human-centered history to looking at animals in history, right? To decenter the human and look at how animals, like white ants, for instance, or cattle, experience or intersect with these human narratives that we see as more prevalent. So that is also, I think, one way of seeing another perspective on the railways that can be quite useful, mainly then through cattle in my case, because that is what is most documented also. But I think there could be also scope for other literature perhaps that could shed some light on this. Next one, thank you. The other part that I have looked at is the construction materials and ecologies, because stones, earth and sand of course went in extensively, but very differently so depending on access to labor and materials, and this also affected the quality, but also more so the physical conditions, like for example in 1863 on contract number 13 that I mentioned before with Joseph Stevens, where he did several parts, he had to change the whole design of the embankment because of the rising water levels and the miscalculations. So this is also ways of seeing how different labors and tools came into the construction of certain stretches. And way that if, for example, the construction material was more expensive in one area, the standard of the railways would go down. So large parts of, for example, this contract number 13 had to be redone after 1867, 68, 69, that's the year when it was reviewed again. So lacking quality in constructions and the materials was a recurrent problem. And you can see these are the local ways of constructing then the foundations, right, for embankments, for instance. And these were all laid down in very strict schedules, like how you should mix the chunam, the different materials for fixing stones and so forth, right, the lime. But it was barely ever followed exactly because of the saving-minded subcontractors who wanted to maximize profit, or the availability of materials would also, of course, impact the cost. Next one, please. So as you can see here on this, also then again contract number 13, where I have a lot of material from Joseph Stevens, is how the gradients would also then be adjusted according to the water courses. And this can also tell us something about how the local water flows was impacted by railways and access to water in these areas. And this again then, if you had to raise the railways, you would need more materials, right? So you would, quite often you would try to use as few materials as possible in the railways in order to minimize the cost. And I'm not saying that is like what affects the local communities here, but it's interesting to see because it becomes an interaction with the local labor and material, what is available and what can be sourced for building the railways. Next one. Another way would of course be the planning of the stations, where we can see how, especially I think it's interesting to see the idea of security, but also the access to water that come in after 1857, after 1857 specifically. Because then when I looked at the bigger cities, for example Jamalpur, which is of course not in this area, but is a big junction point for this extension, the security becomes much more important after 1857 in terms of how to plan infrastructure and access of troops and access of water and access to the jails and the so-called native communities. So this also changes, the idea of what is security and the negotiation of should we be closer to water sources or should we consider the security of the facilities of governance in this certain area. So this is also, I think you can see here how detailed the maps are in terms of marking wells and streams, and if there are perennial streams or seasonal streams and so forth, right? It is extremely detailed, specifically with the railways in mind. And you also need a lot of water for the engines on the railways, right? So this is also taken into consideration that you need a good water source where you plan your station and the sidings of the railway, right? The platforms. And quite frequently you would also have these packing stations nearby for the cotton or a ginning press and so forth, right? So there are lots of things that need water and access to water, which then determine how it is planned. And you see also there in the slightly down or on the right, you see the proposed tank, a well and proposed tank. So these are also like plans for future infrastructure that would aid water access, mainly then of course as it is planned from this perspective for the railways. So let me come to just some concluding remarks, and slightly over time perhaps, or is it okay? Yeah? Yeah. Next, please. What I mainly see from these sources, and this is of course my very tentative, suggestions in terms of my research, and perhaps not so surprising, but if we should say local resistance or reluctance to infrastructure, when I look at specifically this stretch then, which is again a very small part of a big railway project, and very specific in terms of intersecting with this cotton boom of the 1860s, which then coincided with the Civil War, the American Civil War, right? That's why they had this huge push for railways, was access to land, and most importantly then the water in this land, most prominently in connection with cattle. What we can see, secondarily I would say, and I will come back to that in just a second, or maybe I should just mention it now, because it is not directly related to water. It is the access of labor, which would be the last point here. That labor, if you access the land, if you cut off land, you would also then slightly cut off labor from certain agricultural areas. So there would be some contestations about who should, if you build the railways in certain areas, can you bring labor from another region? That would be interfering with the public works departments in other areas which are not connected to the railways. So this would not be like ecological as such, but accessing land through the railways would also then be impacting the labor relations on a much wider scale, which would then, I would say, indirectly be related to land use, right? How you till the land. So daily wage labor, for example, would be less paid if they worked on agricultural land in the low season, but if it's high season, they would be more paid in the agricultural sector than by the railways, and vice versa, right? So this is, of course, then how people use the land can be directly influenced by the construction of the railway, but not necessarily the being of the railway as such, right? But it is more related to the construction of it. So what I plan to look more at, and I hope to dwell more on, is really the accessing of water in different ways, and how that has changed with the construction of the railway, and also the being of the railway, not just the construction as such, but the longer aftermath, where we see this access to land being circumscribed by the infrastructure in terms of not just railways, but also the roads and the feeder roads. Now when I was at the Mumbai archives also, I looked at the coal extensions, for example, where it's also very interesting to see how certain companies benefit from these constructions in the end, right? Like companies that get access to coal extraction that would feed the railways. So these are also, of course, I would be interested to see if I could find more local sources on the construction, and because the mining sector is, of course, a very important also in relation to the railways. Thank you very much.